everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to help celebrate Herzl's birthday. I've got a particular interest in Herzl. Like him, I'm a journalist who once assumed that in Britain, where I was born and bred, the Jewish community was as well integrated and accepted as it was possible to be. Of course, there was always anti-Semitism, but Britain was a place of safety for the Jews, wasn't it? Well, like Herzl, I had a rude awakening, although it wasn't as sharp as his own experience. As a highly assimilated journalist and playwright who was working in Paris towards the end of the 19th century, Herzl's growing unease over anti-Semitism came to a head in 1894. A French army officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was falsely accused of treason because he was a Jew, and he was publicly stripped of his commission. Wrote Herzl, "Death to the Jews," howled the mob as the decorations were being ripped from the captain's coat. Well, with me it took a bit longer for the scales to fall from my eyes and understand that there was an obsessional, pervasive and irrational animosity in Britain towards Israel, and that this was a new mutation of anti-Semitism. This slow dawning upon me started in the early 80s when, as a young journalist who'd never been to Israel, I was horrified by the double standards used to condemn Israel for going to war in the Lebanon to try to destroy Palestinian terrorism. The anti-Semitic venom behind such attitudes became to me undeniable and overwhelming in the year 2000, the year in which I came to Israel for the first time. That year was when British Jews were accused of dual loyalty for supporting Israel because hundreds of their citizens were being blown to bits in the Arab terrorist campaign known as the Second Intifada. And that new reality changed my life, and now I live mainly in Israel. Herzl wasn't the first thinker to advocate that the Jews should become once again an independent nation in their own state, but he was the one who caught the imagination of both the Jewish and non-Jewish world, and through his writings and his extensive political contacts, galvanized Zionism into an international movement. In his 1896 pamphlet Der Judenstaat, The State of the Jews, he argued that in whatever countries Jews made their home, their very presence would inevitably create anti-Semitism. And the only solution to this Jewish question was their own state in their ancient homeland. Well, at the time, many derided his proposal as utopian insanity, and Herzl died young, long before the realization of his dream. He could never have envisaged the Israel of today. He could never have foreseen, for example, the astonishing rebirth of Hebrew, for example, as a living language. Indeed, in Der Judenstaat, he wrote that the new state would encompass a Babel of different languages because, he claimed, quote, "We cannot converse with each other in Hebrew. Who amongst us has a sufficient acquaintance with Hebrew to ask for a railway ticket in that language? Such a thing cannot be done." And yet, here is the Hebrew language today encompassing rather more than requests for train tickets. Herzl also couldn't have foreseen how the 20th century would develop. He couldn't have predicted the 2 world wars or the scale of the Holocaust. And he certainly didn't foresee the persistent hatred of the eventual Jewish state by so much of the world. Indeed, in Der Judenstaat, he wrote, quote, "The Jews, once settled in their own state, would probably have no more enemies. If we only begin to carry out the plans, anti-Semitism would stop at once and forever, for it is the conclusion of peace." Well, he was wrong on that, wasn't he? The establishment of Israel did not, alas, stop anti-Semitism. Israel became instead the Jew among nations. But Herzl would have been astonished by something else: the remarkable strength of Israel and the disarray of its enemies, including its false friends in the West. For not only has Israel defeated its mortal enemies against apparently insuperable odds, it also has strengths of which its enemies can only dream: a booming economy, a healthy birth rate, and a society which ranks as one of the happiest in the world. Meanwhile, the hostile region that surrounds it is deeply unstable. Jordan's monarchical regime is fragile, constantly threatened by incipient revolt from Islamists, Palestinian Arabs, or insurrection fomented by Iran. Iran itself, which ceaselessly threatens to wipe Israel off the map, has been rocked by demonstrations against its Islamist regime, whose corruption and foreign adventurism are held responsible for the misery of the citizens. Egypt is repelling repeated Islamist incursions only by the strong-arm tactics of its president Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. In Europe, countries which claim to be Israel's friends but nevertheless so often act against its safety and security are themselves in a bad way. Their economies are sclerotic or tanking, their indigenous populations aren't reproducing themselves, which threatens the survival of European culture, and they are seeing a steady rise of extremist parties or groups which reflect populations which feel utterly abandoned and scorned by the whole of the mainstream political class. And that was all before the COVID-19 virus started taking such a terrible toll in countries such as Britain, France, or Italy, which were all so slow to grasp the full danger from this disease. By contrast, Israel took prompt and tough-minded measures against the virus and, as a result, has, so far at least, one of the lowest virus death rates in the world. Herzl wanted a state for the Jews to protect them against murderous hatred as a kind of retreat from the rest of the world for their own protection. That persistent threat was, of course, very true then and remains true today. But what's so uplifting is that Israel isn't just a refuge, but a blessing in and of itself. It has the most ethical army in the world. It's always among the first to offer aid to people stricken by natural disasters. It's a powerhouse of medical and scientific advances. Herzl saw the value of a Jewish state as a light unto the nations. In Der Judenstaat, he wrote that the Jewish homeland should form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. Close quote. Well, he got Israel's importance to Europe absolutely right. He couldn't have imagined, though, how tragically blind Western Europe would prove to be to that importance to itself. Yet, despite its permanently embattled state, Israel is extraordinarily resilient, and that's because of the nature of its identity. Unlike Europe, or an increasing proportion of America, Israel still believes in itself and its values, so it accepts the sacrifices that need to be made in its defense. But the ultimate reason that its spirit remains undimmed is that its people understand, even those who are not religiously minded, that they hold the nation in a kind of sacred trust through the bonds of history. It's not just that on Yom HaAtzmaut they celebrate its foundation, or on Yom HaZikaron remember the sacrifices made for the nation. Israel's calendar is built around the history and existential markers of a people stretching back thousands of years: Passover, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and every week, Shabbat. This all connects the people of modern Israel to the generations of Jews that preceded them in an unbroken covenant of love and duty. It's where we live our history every day and where we feel it's still unfolding. And that's the real source of Israel's strength, optimism, and resilience. Herzl wrote in his conclusion to Der Judenstaat that in the reborn Jewish homeland, a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. And whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. So, Yom Holedet Sameach to Herzl, happy 160th birthday, and may his memory always be a blessing.